in infamy.
We interrupt this broadcast to bring you this important bulletin from the United Press. Flash, Washington. The White House announces Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor.
Hello and welcome to Veterans of the Valley. I'm Tom Turbeville. It was natural that Tom Hatfield would write the definitive biography of General Earl Rudder. After all, as a student, he worked summers at the Texas Land Office when General Rudder was its commissioner, and later served in an Army Reserve unit that was under Rudder's command. But that's not why Tom Hatfield wrote the book, Rudder, From Leader to Legend. See, Tom Hatfield is a lifelong educator, and like General Rudder, was a college president, and now is one of the foremost historians on World War II and military history. He's a senior research fellow at the Dolph Briscoe Center for American History at the University of Texas and is director of its Military Institute, History Institute. It is indeed an honor to welcome historian and author Tom Hatfield to Veterans of the Valley. Mr. Hatfield, it is an honor to have you, and thank you for your book on behalf of all Aggies who love General Rudder.
Well, it was a labor of love. I enjoyed all of it.
Absolutely. Nearly a decade in the research and the writing of the book, as I understand.
Well, you could actually say that the research goes back for half a century when I was worked in the land office, as you mentioned, and would see General Rudder then coming and going.
Right.
And that's a superficial impression, but it was nonetheless useful when I was trying to describe him.
Besides your own relationship with General Rudder, with the land office, and then later serving in the reserves under his command, you're 25 years younger than he was. So why, after writing several books on military history, did you choose this significant biography to be your next project?
Well, Rudder had always intrigued me. It interested me. For a long time, I thought he was one of the foremost of the battlefield commanders in the war in Europe. But what most people know about him, and what I knew about him, was what he had done on one day, D-Day, June 6, 1944.
Right.
And, you know, it was 11 months of war after that. And he was awarded every decoration for valor except the Medal of Honor. And so, obviously, he had done a lot after that, but it wasn't in the history books. And so I wanted to know what he had done. And then I wanted to know truly what kind of president was he of Texas A&M from 1959 to 1970, when the great transformational changes occurred. So I really wanted to document those two parts of the story of what did he do during the war, and then what he'd done as president of Texas A&M.
It was a very definitive time when he was president, and it's so significant that this book does deal with the 11 months, as you say, after Pointe du Hoc, which is still so definitive of his battle service as Pointe du Hoc, and we'll talk about that. I guess every author of nonfiction, 90% of the work is the research involved in it, and you researched not only at your desk but by foot, as it says in the preface, and I'll just read it very quickly and you can comment on it. With no idea of writing his biography, I interviewed men in England and France who had known him during the war. The Pointe du Hoc battlefield, where he emerged as a legendary figure, was as familiar as my neighborhood park. So you got to know his every step.
Well, while teaching, I've taught in Normandy several times, and while I was there, I went to Pointe du Hoc regularly, as well as along Omaha Beach, taking groups of students there. So that's how that's how Pointe du Hoc became as familiar to me as it was, and that's probably why increasingly Rudder captured my attention.
Talk about your first introduction to him as working for him at the Texas Land Office, which was actually a statewide race that he actually had to win by election. But talk about really your first interaction with him in the Land Office many years later.
Well, you have to understand that he was the boss man. He was a commissioner, and I was the lowest of the low. I was a half-time worker, a file clerk, and my interaction with him was to to see him coming and going in the land office. I did have a couple of, I rode on the elevator with him a couple of times, and once I remember that we were alone, and it was an awkward moment for me because he was this important person and I was this very unimportant person.
I think you built something for him though, right?
Well, that was several years later.
Oh.
After I had graduated, I'd gone off to the Army, and I came back to go to for graduate study to the University of Texas, and so I was an officer in his attached to his headquarters, and he was in the commanding general of the 90th Infantry Division.
Right.
We were at one of those summer camps at Fort Polk. I was so valuable in the division headquarters that I was assigned responsibility to construct his latrine, and given 2 professional architects and a half dozen other fellows to get the job done, and we did it.
Hey, it was an important facility.
Yeah, it was.
Indeed. His early years, Eden, Texas. For people who don't know where Eden, Texas is, it's where Highway 87 and 83 cross, about 40 miles southeast of San Angelo. Talk about his early years in Eden, and that's where he developed a passion for what would be a part of his early career, and that was the sport of football and really all athletics. Talk about that.
Well, Earl was, as his wife Margaret Rudder said to me, Earl was a town boy. The Rudders did not have land. His father was what was known as a commission man, which meant that he would buy and sell almost anything and take as his profit a percentage of the sale. So life was a stern struggle economically in the Rudder family. Earl was the 5th of 6 brothers. That is, 6 brothers who lived. His mother actually gave birth to 13 children. But he was a popular boy around town, seeming to be happy-go-lucky. In a town no larger than Eden, with population approximately 600, if he or his friends got into mischief, very likely with the social connections between the mothers, in the town, his mother would know about it before he got home. And his mother was really the sort of the backbone of the family, insistent upon church attendance. And so that's then in 1925, when he was 15 years old, Eden had a football team for the first time, and there he discovered his passion, which eventually became his ticket. The way it took him out of Eden because he was awarded a scholarship to play at the institution we now know as Tarleton State University, which was then a 2-year branch of Texas A&M.
Right.
So that's how he left Eden, and it was football that gave him his handhold on life.
Let's fast forward there to Tarleton, because he did leave Eden. He went to Tarleton. He played football there. And there was a gentleman that you write about in his book that was probably the first and a very significantly influential person in his life, and that was his football coach, not because of his coaching of X's and O's, Coach W.L. Wisdom, obviously a very important person in Earl Rudder's life.
Well, his coach, W.J. Wisdom, who was not only a self-taught coach with a remarkable won and loss record, but he was also known for his ethics. That he posted where his players would see in the dressing room the great line from the sports writer Grantland Rice that's mostly been forgotten now, that when the one great scorer comes to mark beside your name, he cares not whether you won or lost, but how you played the game. Well, Rudder and W.J. Wisdom were great competitors, to be sure, but how you played the game, how you treated the other players, how you related to the officials of the game were also very important to them, and Wisdom became the Rudder's role model, a positive role model in some ways his father was a negative role model, so W.J. Wisdom offset that difference between him and his father.
Indeed, you write in the book, from Wisdom, Rudder would learn much more than coaching techniques and game strategies. He would gradually absorb the subtleties of managing and motivating young men to perform demanding tasks while working together at the upper limits of their physical exertion. Obviously, this was a precursor to him being a commander in World War II and a president of a university. So it started way back then.
Oh, that's right. And the coaching was just the perfect preparation to command an elite special forces type of unit, the 2nd Ranger Battalion.
He entered Texas A&M in 1930, finished in 21 months. When he first arrived, you said in your book that they thought that he was probably sharp enough to finish in 3 years. He went through A&M and got his degree in 21 months, and I think you said that even in the middle of that, he spent about 3 months serving in military training.
Well, that's right. I found in the registrar's office at Texas A&M the records of the counseling session when he arrived on the campus in September of 1930, and his academic counselor estimated that he would be in the class of 1933. But Rudder took maximum load and more, that is course load. He did not go home to Eden in that first summer. He went for summer training, as cadets were required to do, and then he returned to the campus, and always with numerous part-time jobs, as well as playing football. And so he finished up by graduating in May of 1932, 21 months.
Right, right. 1932, you mentioned in your book, and you credit a gentleman that we've had on our show, Henry Deathloff, as saying that people who graduated from college in 1932 were probably the hardest hit by the Depression. And when he graduated, he had no job, and you said he had to actually go back to Eden just to eat while he was looking for a job.
That's what he said. He said he went all over the state trying to find a job, and the job he wanted was coaching high school football and teaching in high school. He had prepared himself to be a football coach while here at Texas A&M, as well as to teach, and there were just no jobs available. And so, as he told someone years later, in order to eat, he had to go back home. So he went to Eden and got a job, really a pick and shovel job, working on the roads, on the highways. The Texas Highway Department was in building roads across West Texas. And that's what he did the first year he was out of college.
And then he found just down the road, just a little bit southeast of Eden, or east of Eden, is where it was, a town called Brady, Texas, which obviously meant a lot to him, and that's where he got his first teaching and coaching job.
That's right. Yeah, Brady became his adopted home.
Right.
And so that's where he was football coach from 1933 to 1938. With a very good record, and he was popular in the town. He was also a very popular teacher.
He made a whopping $100 a month for 9 months.
That's the first year. He got and a couple of years later, he started getting $110 a month.
Well, good
and
race,
he got paid for 10 months rather than 9 months.
But he was not only coaching football and baseball; he was teaching math, history,
chemistry,
right, for $100 a month.
That's right.
But
yeah, he said those preparations were really hard. That he learned a lot in preparing. You see, and he became the student as a teacher that he really had never been before.
Right.
And many people have had that experience of learning more while teaching than while being the student.
1933 was a very important year in his life, obviously, because he met a lady named Margaret Williamson, who they called Chick.
That's right.
They kind of fell in love dancing in the dance halls at Menard, Texas. So obviously that was a union that was very important and very lasting.
Well, it was sort of a long-term courtship. You see, they first began meeting to dance an upscale dance hall type in Menard, Texas, which was sort of between the Williamson Ranch, where she lived, and Eden, where he lived. And that was on through the summer of 1933. But they did not marry until 4 years later.
Talk about, he was at Tarleton, like you said, and he was he got the head coaching job at Tarleton. That's where I'm going, in the summer of 1938. And he was helped in that, getting that job, by a fellow that a famous building on campus is named after. Sort of talk about the relationship between him and G. Raleigh White.
Well, it's a very interesting story. G. Raleigh White was was an important person around Brady, and one of the really major, certainly a major landholder in the region, and a well-known citizen in Texas. He was then a member of the governing board of Texas A&M, and the governing board really had oversight of the appointments to any one of the components of the Texas A&M system. So G. Raleigh White had the potential, in fact was, quite influential in helping Rudder to become the head football coach at Tarleton. The interesting thing about all this is, which shows something of Rudder's character, is that there were two banks in Brady. One was a bank owned by Mr. White, and there was another bank there as well. A couple of years before, probably 1936, Rudder had gone to Mr. White's bank and made application for a loan. White was out of town and it was denied. He then immediately went to the competitive bank, filed his application, and it was approved. And after that, for Rudder's entire life, he banked only with the competitor for Mr. White. He would not compromise, not even when White would be decisive in his appointment to Tarleton. And I think it's an extraordinary story. White helped him, but Rudder never compromised in his loyalty to the competitive bank.
That is an amazing story. I want to move on to his military history, because this is a story that certainly is hard to tell in 30 minutes, but we're giving it a try. June of 1941, reported active duty, First Lieutenant James E. Rudder, 2nd Infantry Division. Promoted the very next day to captain. And talk about his early military career leading up to, obviously this was before Pearl Harbor, but then get us into the preparation for the Normandy landing and the final push, and what does define Earl Rudder, and that is the days June 6th through June 8th of Pointe du Hoc.
Well, you're right. He was called to active duty in June of 1941, and was in this country involved in just training until late November of 1943. Right. One of those assignments was as a training officer of the 83rd Infantry Division, which was based in Indiana. And some high-ranking general passed down an order that all infantry divisions should make Ranger-type training available. That is based on strength and endurance, teamwork, and the training would involve competition, very physical, tough stuff. Well, the general who made that mandate came for a visit, and what Rudder was doing was the best Ranger-type training that he had ever seen. And Rudder was not a Ranger at the time, but the general also had under his command a newly formed unit called the 2nd Ranger Battalion, which was at Camp Forest, Tennessee, near Chattanooga, and it was not progressing well. And so he selected Rudder on the basis of what he saw of Rudder's training program in the 83rd Division. He picked out Rudder to become the commanding officer of the 2nd Ranger Battalion. So Rudder then moved to the 2nd Ranger Battalion, and through there in Tennessee, and amphibious training in Florida, and finally up the East Coast to board the Queen Elizabeth in New York Harbor in late November of '43, that's the training, that's the stateside training period. In England, he arrived without knowing what his mission would be. At the time, everyone knew that there would be an attack from Britain across the English Channel on the French coast in the spring of '44. So he didn't know what his mission was. On January 4th, 1944, he was called to General Omar Bradley's headquarters and told that the 2nd Ranger Battalion it was essential that the 2nd Ranger Battalion would make this attack on this impregnable cliffs on the Normandy coast called Point du Hoc, and knock out 6 large German guns that were in place there. And Bradley said it was the most difficult assignment he made to any officer under his command in the entire war. And with Rudder doing it, the 2nd Ranger Battalion being successful, he was thereafter, that's when he became a legend and an icon in the United States Army.
One point in the book, and I'll just go over it, that I just found fascinating that people don't know is that this Provisional Ranger Group that was given this assignment, there were 3 task force, A, B, and C. And originally he had assigned himself and his staff to Task Force C. But the person that he had assigned to command Task Force A, unfortunately, got drunk the day before the mission. Rudder fired him and assigned himself to Task Force A, and that was the one that went directly to Point du Hoc.
That's correct. Yeah. Well, there were 2 Ranger battalions involved in the Normandy landings. There was Rudder's 2nd Ranger Battalion, and then another battalion, the 5th Ranger Battalion, had come over from the States in late January of '44. So both battalions were placed under Rudder's command.
Right.
And it was his responsibility to design the attack plan. There were for the 3 missions that they needed to accomplish. Well, since he was an overall command, he had a separate, had another officer would command Task Force A, Task Force B, and Task Force C. And Rudder would be in overall command, and just where he would go ashore would depend upon the success of the first landings.
Right.
Well, the man he picked out to command Task Force A to make the assault on Point du Hoc got drunk. They were on board a British ship. There was a bar in the wardroom of nearly all British vessels. Actually, they'd already gone to sea en route to Point du Hoc, and Rudder didn't know anything about it. They were under radio silence. They didn't know until Eisenhower canceled. He put off the invasion by 1 day, from June 5th to June 6th.
Right.
So when they returned to port, again, still under radio silence, then Rudder learned of what this officer, the drunkenness of this officer, and he then appointed a committee to investigate the rumors, the stories he'd heard, and his committee came back saying yes, that it was true. And what I say is that showed he had the instincts of a university president, that he would appoint a committee to make this investigation rather than relying on his own judgment. So he basically fired the officer in charge of the task force going to Point du Hoc and took his place.
Right.
All of that sounds like, at the moment, then it sounded like disaster, but in fact, the derelict officer had changed history for the better, because Rudder performed superbly, and the officer who took the other task force that he would have been with performed equally superb.
We just have a few minutes left. We're running. I want to. The name of the book is Rudder from Leader to Legend. Let's run through some photographs from the book that were supplied to us by various people in the book. And we'll just run through them real quick because we want to get on to his time at A&M. There's the cover of the book, Rudder from Leader to Legend. This is an early photograph, 1932, from when he was a student, cadet at Texas A&M. Margaret Rudder supplied that picture from his service in World War II. And this is from Point de Hoc and the preparation for the scaling of the cliffs. There is Earl and Margaret Rudder at the time that they were married in 1937. This is when he was actually, I believe, vice president before he became president.
No, he was president.
Was he president at that time?
Mm-hmm.
Visiting some folks over at the battalion, I think. And he's a very close relationship with President Johnson. And finally, in 1970, in March of 1970, his passing, and nearly 5,000 turned out at G. Raleigh White Coliseum for his memorial service. We just have a few minutes left, and I knew that this would happen, but if you would, just his presidency at Texas A&M, it came during a time, the Vietnam War, the Kennedy assassination. It was a very essential time in our nation's history, and obviously for Texas A&M. Talk about his presidency.
Well, it was a tumultuous time, and he gained considerable national attention by his outspoken opposition to disorders, student disorders on the Texas A&M campus, as well as on any campus in the United States. And it's easy to forget now about how serious some of those disorders, in fact, the riots and the destruction were on some other campuses, including several were killed, students were killed. So he maintained order, but I think the most important things he did as president was the sort of transformational changes that he led. At some point fairly early in his presidency, he really came to the realization that A&M had to change. At the time, it was all male and all military, and with limited degree programs, and it was someone described it as a suboptimal regional land-grant college and not a comprehensive university.
Mr. Hatfield, I'm sorry, but we're 30 minutes goes by very quickly. So
Good.
if people want to know the rest of it, they can buy the book, and we hope they do.
Yeah.
Texas A&M University Press, $30, a great buy. You can go online to tamupress.com. Thank you very much for what you did.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
I appreciate it. In a few days, Rudder from Leader to Legend will be in bookstores, and it's a must-read for not just those with a passion for military history or World War II, but certainly all those throughout the world who hold Texas A&M and its history so dear. We thank Tom Hatfield for his authorship of this wonderful book and for being our guest today. I'm Tom Turbeville. Join us next time on Veterans of the Valley.